Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the new Webster All Marble Inventing the Outdoors Museum located at the new Commerce Center in Escanaba, Michigan. Little history about the display itself and the artifacts. In 2014, the state of Michigan had a major donation of the marble items donated to the state by a Dennis Pace from Lansing, Michigan area. I got involved when they asked me to appraise the collection for tax purposes for Dennis. And after that, I was invited, along with Ann Miller, down to Lansing for the grand opening at the History Center in Lansing. And it was the most visited exhibit they ever had, single most visited exhibit they ever had. It was just fantastic. And we spent the night down there, Annie and her husband and I, and on the way home, all we could talk about was, wouldn't this be nice to come back home to Delta County? Fast forward a year, 2016, it went to Negaunee at the Iron Museum for a year, a little over a year. And it was displayed in Negaunee. During that interim of time, a number of folks got involved with not just the marble products and the museum products to bring back to Delta County, but also the new visitor center. After a home was decided on and agreed to with a major donation from the Bessie Foundation, people behind the scenes with the state of Michigan and local people, Vicki Mishaw primarily, Annie Miller, made a case that this should come back to Delta County, and it happened. We're very pleased with the exhibit, and I know anybody who visited, so far anybody who has visited, they love it. Now moving on to Webster All Marble himself. Webster All Marble was born in Frankfort, Michigan in the 1860s, came to the UP as a woodsman, a landlooker, for those of you who want a familiar term, timber cruiser, or land surveyor today they call them. He worked for major lumber companies. At that time when he was living up here, he lived in Garden, worked for the major timber companies across the upper Michigan, because timber was king here. And while he was in the outdoors, he realized we need better stuff. If we're going to work in the outdoors, if we're going to survive in the outdoors, we need better compasses, knives, axes, ways to keep our matches dry. So as he cruised the timberlands of upper Michigan, and in this display case you will see his actual timber cruising books. These were notations that he wrote in his daily logs. These are dated 1895 or so. While he sat around the campfire at night, he would make drawings. Okay, how can I make a better axe, a better compass? This is a guy who lived it, he worked it. So he knew what he needed. So he came up with the three basics: an ideal knife, an ideal axe, match safe, and a compass. Four. And this is a representation of the four that he first started this company with. A pin-on compass to go on his coat, a safety axe that wouldn't hang on the belt so much because the leather and everything was cumbersome. He could put it in his bag or whatever, and what he considered the ideal knife. The match safes that he designed after falling in the Sturgeon River and got his matches wet. And he needed something to keep his matches dry. Matches were lifesavers at that time. Nobody had Bic lighters or Zippos. And after trial and error, he came up with using a 16 and a 12 gauge shotgun put together with a rubber gasket on the bottom with a screw top. And that constantly evolved. He made about 19 different versions of the match safe. That's one of the things he's most famous for, as is the Marble Safety Axe, which he named his company in 1892. After an economic decline in the early 1890s, he went back to timber cruising for 4 or 5 years. But then in 1895, he moved back to Gladstone with his family. He was now married, had a child, and started a company with some investors called the Marble Safety Axe Company. It was licensed in 1898. And from that point on, he was a inventing genius, one thing after another. He's got over 60 patents to his name, a number of improvements on other items, but his basic 4 that he built his company on were the safety axe, the ideal knife, the match safe, and the compass. Moving along here, when he would get home in the evening from his working in the woods and take his notebooks, he would put them in reports to the timber companies, and that's what we have located here. Excuse me. Moving along, this is kind of what he did. He lived in lean-tos under trees out in the woods. People don't do that anymore. A few Boy Scouts still do. But for the most part, this representation is what it was like to live in the UP in the 1890s. There were very few campgrounds, if any, very few hotels, if any. So when you came to the UP, you kind of lived in a tent or a lean-to, as we can see from background photos in the back of hunters from wherever coming up here in the 1890s, early 1900s. This big display is a good representative of everything marbles had to do with the outdoors. Again, the lean-to. You'll see this representative figure trying to make a fire with the Marbles match safe. He's got a classic Marbles ideal knife, leather with a stag handle, a Marbles safety axe, and of course he's wearing a Marbles compass, pin-on long stem compass. And the clothing is all period correct too. So if we move around to the match safes, again, he started making them out of 2 brass shotgun shells. Those were the shotgun shells of the period. They constantly evolved till this is what they look like today. They made a number of different ones for gift sets, for specialty markets. They made one for herders, the catalog company. They made one for a contractor working on the Panama Canal, because those that worked down there, obviously with the wet environment down there, they wanted dry matches. And he saw the Marbles match safe and had Marbles make match safes for their company. Coming over here, we see the evolution of the Marbles compass. His first compass was a long stem pin-on compass with a big long spring. This one is nickel plated. You could get it nickel plated in the early days. They later evolved to strictly brass. Then they went to a shorter brass stem, a pocket one. They made them for rifles. They made them for the wrist. They made about 25 different compasses. This beautiful display here with the card donated by the Iron Museum in Negaunee is a representation of what was going on in the UP in the early part of the 20th century. Obviously the Model A and Model T, Henry Ford, people were traveling. They were going to the UP. They heard about the UP that Congress said should remain a wilderness forever, by the way. People were coming up here in droves. They heard about the UP. A lot of people came by train from the big metro areas of Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, but a lot of people came by cars. Obviously, there was no bridge, but they came around and they came to the UP. They camped out of their vehicles, which was a common thing to do in the early part of the 20th century. And we like the picture of the women in the outdoors too. Women were getting into it real heavy. And you see some of the Marble products. Marble actually made a tent for a Model A and a Model T that would snap onto it. And here's a picture of the tents. Moving along over here, we'll talk about the evolution of the marble axe. Marble made about 40 different models of his axe. By that I mean he made like a steel-handled axe with different size heads, number 1, 2, and 3. And then he made wood handles 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and a 10, including a double bit. His first axe was an axe that folded in half like a jackknife. He only made about 19 of those, and they're extremely rare today. Very hard to find, but they weren't strong enough. But it could fit in his little bag or in his back pocket or in a jacket pocket. But he constantly evolved the axe as he did every product that he made. You could have a pistol holder for it to put on your belt. You could loop it through your belt with the folding guard. They are still made today. And again, everybody in the world wants a marble axe. Backing up a little bit, what was also very popular in the UP was fishing and commercial fishing. Marbles got into the fish handling business, if you want to call it that. He made this what's called an automatic gaff in 3 different sizes. This long one with the handle with a spring-loaded trap jaw. And believe me, it's a weapon. The first one I saw, I was talking to an elderly gentleman back in the 70s who ran a commercial fishing company in Gladstone. Said they always kept one on the gunnel of the boat when they were pulling in their nets because of a whitefish or lake trout or walleye or whatever they were fishing popped out of their net, their gill net or their trap net. That thing was always on standby, fully loaded and cocked, and they would just snap it on the back of the fish. He also made hand ones, a trout nipper to put in your fishing creel, a fish grabber to put in your boat if you're fishing walleye. And because he made those fishing items, he also made fish knives, what's called a ring trout knife. It's got surgical steel almost in it. It's very, very sharp. He made a curved fish knife and a folding fish knife. A lot of what Webster made was folding. He was a smaller gentleman, and I think he liked small items. There's no way to know. Again, because fishing was so popular in Michigan, Michigan has more water frontage than any state in the Union besides Alaska. A lot of companies got their start in Michigan with the fishing industry. Everything from the Swedish Pimple Factory in Gladstone to the Dowagiac Lure Company, Shakespeare, and a few of the other famous outdoors. So this is just a complimentary display for the period. Moving along, we're going to get into the Marble Sight Company. The Marble Sight Company is still in business today. Back in the day, they made a sight, front sight, rear sight, or a peep sight for virtually every single gun sold in the United States. That's saying something. They are still used today. They're still made today. People want them. This is a display of the new stuff. So, the firearms industry he got into in 1908 when he made the Marble's Game Getter rifle. Keeping in mind this period of time, in early 1900 to 1915 or so, people were peddling bikes, okay? Every bicycle company, or I should say every gun manufacturer made what they call a bicycle gun to fit on a bicycle. And it was usually mounted on the frame behind the handlebars. Marbles designed their game getter primarily after the bicycle gun, but it was primarily used for trappers, hunters, and he said it's the only gun you'll ever need. It was a 22 rifle, long rifle over a 44 shot or 44 ball. He made two different versions. The 1908, the first model in the back with the folding stock, and the second model down the front, just a little more modern version with the folding stock also. Unfortunately, they were made illegal by the 1928 Gun Control Act, so that was the end of that. So, to complement the gun industry, he made, obviously, gun oil solvent, cleaning kits, and what's called a bullet adapter and bullet extractor. In other words, you could, a bullet adapter, you could put it in your 30-30, but you could load on it a 22 or 32. And he made them for both rifles and shotgun. The extractor was a cartridge-sized tool that was put in your gun to remove a broken cartridge. This is an evolution of the powder in firearms, and a lot of times the old brass shells would split. So they made a tool called a broken shell extractor for removing those. So he made everything for every gun. Again, a bullet adapter and shell extractor for virtually every gun sold in America. Moving along to some nice representative displays of marble knives and some printing blocks, his catalogs and monthly messages. The printing blocks we can pick up locally, they're quite available. The monthly messages and quarterly messages, Christmas messages and catalogs. One thing that's amazing for marbles of his time was advertising. He was way ahead of his time in advertising. For a little company on the shores of Little Beatty Knock, he was sending out millions of advertising flyers and advertising ads in fur fishing game, hunter, trader, trapper, outdoor life, and such as them. We have a display here of a number of artifacts that Marble made, from folding screwdrivers to working on the gun to folding knives, specialty knives that he made. His longest lasting two knives were the Woodcraft and the Ideal. But he made what was called a trail maker too, a huge camping knife, if you want to call it that. 10-inch carbon steel blade. You could use it as an axe, you could use it as a knife. He made folding kitchen knives. He just made any kind of knife that they felt there was a need for. You'll see a photo here of Webster Marble and Claude Hawkins, his sales manager at the time, in Madison Square Garden in New York in 1902, I think it was, not quite sure. They sold out in the first day, and they had enough orders for the next 2 years. But I can just imagine those two gentlemen from Gladstone in 1902 in Madison Square Garden. They do have the deer in the headlight look on their face, I know that. Next to them, there was a company called Bean, today known as the L.L. Bean Company, L.L. Bean sporting goods store. And I've been to the museum in Freeport, Maine. They have a museum in the basement of the old store. And I was talking to the curator, and he told me that they like to think they grew up as companies together. They're both still in business today, which is amazing. Trade show sign that we have over here from 1953, 1950s I should say, Sportsman's Show in Chicago. Now we really don't know two of the gentlemen. The guy on the far right is a gentleman named Harold Mackey, and his son donated this display to us. Up above is an extremely rare sign that was taken to trade shows all across the Midwest. Moving along, we see some of his very early and rarer knives. Again, he made, as far as I can figure, about 300 different versions of a combination of 30 to 40 knives with blade lengths, handle construction, blade stamps, dating. So he made a whole lot of different knives in a whole lot of different ways. Here's the factory in Gladstone, would span 2.5 blocks on Superior Avenue from about 1898 till the 1960s, excuse me, when they built a new factory. And when they were tearing this one down, they decided to let the local volunteer fire department practice with it. Well, you know what happened. It went up. But we did save a lot of artifacts out of that place. They're available today. A lot of old photographs of the original factory we've been able to find. Everything from the assembly room for the game getter, to the wood shop. So there's a lot of neat history here for those of you who don't know or want to know more about Gladstone. Marble's first factory was in his garage, by the way. And this building is still standing on Wisconsin Avenue in Gladstone. It's between the Webster All Marble house and his daughter's house. You drive in between the driveways. There's an apartment above now. It's a garage. But at one time, there was a tunnel from the basement of the house to his factory. That was where he made his first items, all made by hand. Moving along, this is a representative display of the actual stones that were used to polish the marble knives. Knives, nationally and internationally, are famous for their finish. And this is just a piece of what it looked like. Some of the major players in the marble company: Frank Van Cleve Park in Gladstone, Bill Marble, his son, James T. Jones. Webster was smart enough to realize that he was not a businessman. He was an outdoorsman. He knew what he wanted made, but he needed business, a business sense. So he called, or wrote a letter, most likely, to Ferris College and said, "Give me your best and brightest student." And they sent up James T. Jones, and the rest is history. There's a school named after James T. Jones in Gladstone. Clifford Merker was working at marbles as a teenager, as a lot of them did, including my grandfather. And during World War I, he took a number of marble items with him to the war, and he carried a marbles match safe, in his pocket. And he deflected a bullet that saved his life. That match safe never left his pocket again for the rest of his life. In fact, he's buried with it today. And he was eventually a manager at Marble Arms. This is a photograph of Marble Arms and manufacturing companies. So it's circa 1912 or 1911 at Labor Day Parade. Picture of Gladstone at that time. We were also able to run across bits and pieces of a film produced by Webster Marble when he was 63 years old, showing off his finished products, and also parts of Gladstone, other businesses in Gladstone, Coburn's Drug Store, Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company, and a few others, McGillis and Gibbs. Boy, we wish we could find the rest of that, but we only had a few film strips. These are also a few of the products that Marble made for a short period of time. Gun cleaning kits, obviously, the wrist compasses, the axes. He made a saw set. For those of you who don't know, a saw set, when you sharpened a saw, nobody just threw them away back then. They sharpened their saw. But when you sharpen a saw, you have to offset the teeth. So that this tool that Marble made was in every carpentry shop, and it would offset the teeth for you. Marble's also bid on the jet pilot survival knife just prior to the Korean War. They used an existing style of the ideal knife with a blood groove, which the Army gave their specs for. They wanted a blood groove. They also wanted a sawtooth back on it to be able to saw through soft aluminum, because these are jets now. They made 4 different models, or 2 different models, I'm sorry, and 4 different versions, with a 6-inch blade and a 5-inch blade. They were taken to Washington in 1957. They were awarded the contract, the initial contract, and then the government withdrew from that because they had the low bid, they had the finest product, but they didn't employ enough people. And the government says, well, we want you to employ more people. Well, that didn't happen. But today, they're highly sought after among military collectors and marble knife collectors. During the Vietnam War, local boys who were going to Vietnam could go down and get a free marble knife, survival knife, to take to the war. So, Marble's lasting legacy is all over the county. Besides James T. Jones School, there's Marble Athletic Field, streets named after marbles. There's real estate named after Marble. The park named after Frank Van Cleve. There was an offspring of a number of knife companies. Although no longer made in Gladstone, Bark River Knives has the right to make the classic marble knives, of which we have a couple of. But they're not the small knife companies that started them. Primarily Rapper River Knife Works and Bark River Knife Works, who make classic marble style knives today and their own versions of knives. Beatty Knock Lure Company worked hand in hand with Marbles. For a while they did the nickel plating on the Marble match safe. So there is a lasting legacy in Delta County, and that all goes back to the day he started, when he said, I want to make my factory here in Gladstone. So that's pretty much it. Stop in and see our display. Got any questions? Somebody's usually around here, but we can try and find answers to any questions you might have.